The Last Confession. Detective Shernan's Cold Case 473 Disclaimer. The following story contains sensitive content including discussions of murder, execution, and violence. It is only suitable for viewers 18 years and older. All names, locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect the identities of those involved. While based on real events, this story is presented for informational and educational purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised. Introduction. I've stared into the eyes of dying men more times than I care to count. There's a peculiar clarity that comes to a person in their final moments and honesty that can't be manufactured or faked. After 32 years investigating homicides, I've developed what some might call a sixth sense for truth. It's not mystical, it's merely experience. The human face can only arrange itself in so many ways when confronted with its own mortality. My name is Detective Marcus Shernan. I specialize in cases that others have abandoned, the unsolved, the forgotten, the ones labeled impossible. I work independently now, following 3 decades with the Bureau, because some investigations require a freedom that bureaucracy doesn't allow. The case I'm about to share with you has haunted me for 15 years. It's changed how I view justice, truth, and the systems we've built to separate the two. Before we begin, I need you to understand that unlike most stories, this one doesn't have a neat ending tied with a bow. Sometimes the most important cases are the ones that raise more questions than they answer. Tonight, I'm going to take you through the case that keeps me awake at night. The execution of Terrence Walker for the brutal murder of the Reynolds family in 2003. A man who went to his death, maintaining his innocence, whose final words were not a confession, but a proclamation. I didn't do it. Someday you'll know. What if he was telling the truth? What if our justice system, with all its checks and balances, sent an innocent man to death? And what if I was partly responsible? Pour yourself something strong. You're going to need it. Part 1. The Crime. On April 18, 2003, in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oak Ridge Heights, the unthinkable happened. Richard Reynolds, his wife Eleanor, and their 16-year-old daughter Carolyn were found brutally murdered in their home. Their 14-year-old son, Michael, was found barely alive, having suffered multiple stab wounds and severe head trauma. I still remember the call coming in at 2:17 a.m. Spring rain was pelting against my bedroom window as the phone rang. That distinctive shrill that always meant death was waiting somewhere. Shernan, I answered, my voice thick with interrupted sleep. Detective, we've got a multiple homicide in Oak Ridge. It's bad, really bad. The dispatch officer's voice cracked slightly. When that happens, you know the scene is going to be worse than you can imagine. I'd been a homicide detective for 13 years at that point, and I thought I'd seen everything. I was wrong. The Reynolds house stood in a well-maintained cul-de-sac oak trees, pristine lawns, the American dream packaged into 3 0 square feet of real estate. That night, it was transformed into something from a nightmare, illuminated by the rotating red and blue lights of police cruisers, the harsh white of crime scene floodlights. Yellow tape cordoned off the property, but it couldn't contain the horror inside. The smell hit me first, the metallic tang of blood mixed with the acrid scent of fear. People don't realize that fear has a smell. Once you've encountered it enough times, you never forget it. Richard Reynolds had been killed in the living room, multiple stab wounds, defensive injuries on his hands and arms. A businessman with no known enemies, he had put up a considerable fight. Eleanor was found in the master bedroom upstairs, her body positioned in a way that suggested she had been trying to reach for the phone. Carolyn, the daughter, had been attacked in her sleep, her room bearing signs of a struggle only after the initial assault. Michael, the boy, had been discovered in the hall bathroom, unconscious but alive, huddled in the bathtub with the shower curtain pulled down around him. His survival seemed miraculous given his injuries. What struck me immediately was the savagery of the attack. This wasn't a professional hit or a robbery gone wrong. This was rage, personal, visceral rage. Any signs of forced entry? I asked the first officer on scene, a rookie named Jameson, who was looking a little green around the gills. None, sir. Looks like they let the killer in or he had a key. That detail immediately narrowed our focus. This wasn't a random attack. The Reynolds family knew their killer. Have you ever had that feeling at the base of your spine? That cold certainty that something is fundamentally wrong with the scene in front of you? I felt it that night as I walked through that house. Something about the position of the bodies, the pattern of the blood spatter, the items disturbed and undisturbed. It didn't fit together, but I couldn't put my finger on why. The forensic team worked methodically, photographing, collecting, cataloging. Blood samples, fingerprints, fibers, the painstaking process of building a case piece by microscopic piece. We found plenty of fingerprints, but all matched family members or known visitors. No unknown DNA was recovered from the victims' bodies. What we did find was a single bloody boot print in the upstairs hallway, size 12, from a relatively common work boot, and a partial handprint on the banister that didn't match any family member, though the print was smudged enough that it wouldn't provide conclusive identification. Michael Reynolds remained unconscious in the hospital, his head trauma so severe that doctors weren't certain if he would ever wake up, let alone remember the attack. Without a witness, without clear DNA evidence, we were left with the daunting task of reconstructing the events of that night through detective work alone, the old-fashioned way. Think about your own home for a moment. Who has access? Who knows your routine? Who might you open the door to, even late at night? The killer is almost always someone connected to the victim. A stranger didn't murder the Reynolds family. This was someone they knew, someone they trusted enough to let into their home after midnight. During the first 48 hours, those critical hours where leads are freshest, we compiled a list of everyone connected to the family. Richard's business associates, Eleanor's friends and colleagues from the hospital where she worked as a nurse, the children's friends, teachers, extended family members. On the third day of the investigation, a name rose to the surface: Terrence Walker. Walker was a 37-year-old construction worker who had done extensive renovations on the Reynolds home 6 months prior. He had a record 2 assaults and 1 domestic violence charge that had been dropped when his ex-girlfriend refused to testify. He had been seen arguing with Richard Reynolds at a local hardware store 2 weeks before the murders, a heated exchange witnessed by several shoppers. When we brought him in for questioning, he was defensive, agitated. He admitted to the argument, but claimed it was about payment for additional work he'd done that Reynolds was refusing to cover. "Yeah, I was angry," he told me across the interrogation table, his large, handscapable hands, working hands fidgeting with a styrofoam cup of water. "The man owed me nearly $2,000 for work I did out of pocket, but I didn't kill him. I wouldn't. I couldn't do something like that." There was something in his eyes of fear that seemed disproportionate to simple questioning. It made my instincts flare. "Where were you on the night of April 18th, between midnight and 3 a.m.? I asked him, watching his face carefully. His alibi was weak. He claimed to have been home alone, sleeping. No one could verify his whereabouts. When we executed a search warrant on his residence, we found a pair of work boots, size 12, with traces of what appeared to be blood in the treads. In his truck, we recovered a utility knife with microscopic blood residue in the handle seams. Most damning of all, we found a watch belonging to Richard Reynolds hidden in a toolbox in Walker's garage. The evidence, while circumstantial, painted a compelling picture. Walker had motive: the money dispute. He had Minsha's strength as a construction worker, his familiarity with knives. He had opportunity knowledge of the house layout, and potentially a key from the renovation work. What he didn't have was an alibi. When Michael Reynolds finally regained consciousness 2 weeks after the attack, his testimony seemed to seal Walker's fate. Though his memory was fragmentary, he claimed to have seen the construction man in the hallway that night. Although he couldn't positively identify Walker in a lineup, the suggestion was powerful. Terrence Walker was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The prosecution sought the death penalty. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The evidence mounted. Walker's defense team attempted to suggest other suspects a business partner of Richard's who stood to gain from insurance payouts, a neighbor with whom Eleanor had a long-standing feud. None of these alternatives had the combination of motive, means, and opportunity that Walker had. Throughout the trial, Walker maintained his innocence with a desperation that was either the mark of a truthful man or an exceptionally good performer. "I did not kill that family," he would say, looking directly at me whenever I was in the courtroom. "I'm being set up. Someone is setting me up." The jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge sentenced Terrence Walker to death by lethal injection. I still remember the moment the sentence was read. Walker collapsed in his chair. His large frame suddenly diminished. He looked at me with those eyes, those frightened eyes that had made my instincts flare during interrogation, and mouthed the words, "I didn't do it. I told myself it was what they all say. I told myself justice had been served. I was wrong." Have you ever wondered how many innocent people have been executed in America? The Innocence Project estimates at least 20 innocent people have been executed since 1976. But what if the number is higher? What if Terrence Walker was one of them? I want you to sit with that thought for a moment. Imagine being convicted of a crime you didn't commit. Imagine spending years on death row, knowing the date of your death, watching the calendar pages turn, all while maintaining your innocence to deaf ears. How would you feel? What would you do? Part 2. The Doubt. For 10 years, I didn't think about Terrence Walker. Not consciously, anyway. The case was solved. Justice served. I moved on to other investigations, other killers, other victims. But sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, his eyes would appear in my mind, those frightened eyes, pleading for belief. Then, in 2013, everything changed. I was 3 years from retirement, assigned to cold cases, the files that had grown dusty with neglect, but still contained lives interrupted, justice delayed. My desk was piled with boxes from the evidence locker, cases from the 90s primarily, when DNA testing was still in its infancy. That's when Michael Reynolds walked into my office. He wasn't the traumatized 14-year-old anymore. He was 24, a man now, with his father's build and his mother's eyes. I recognized him immediately. "Detective Shernan," he said, extending his hand. "I don't know if you remember me." "Michael," I said, rising to shake his hand. "Of course I remember you." He sat across from me, fidgeting slightly, a mannerism that reminded me painfully of Terrence Walker in the interrogation room all those years ago. "I need to talk to you about what happened to my family," he said. I think we got it wrong." Those words sent a chill through me so profound, I can still feel it today. Michael explained that in the decades since the murders, his memory had been returning not all at once, but in fragments, dreams, sudden flashes of recollection triggered by seemingly unrelated events. "I told you I saw the construction man that night," he said, his voice low. "But I realize now. I saw him earlier that day, doing some touch-up work. My mind confused the timing after the trauma." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "The man I saw in the hallway that night wasn't Terrence Walker. It was someone else, someone I knew." "Who?" I asked, already reaching for a pen and pad. "My Uncle James, my mother's brother. James Farrell, Eleanor Reynolds' younger brother, a man who had been interviewed during the initial investigation and cleared. A man who had sat through every day of Walker's trial, supporting his nephew, the sole survivor. A man who had delivered a victim impact statement at Walker's sentencing, describing his devastation at losing his sister. Why would your uncle kill your family?" I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, possible motives were clicking into place in my mind. "Money," Michael said simply. "My parents had a large life insurance policy. With them gone, I was the beneficiary, but I was underage." Uncle James became my guardian and the trustee of the funds until I turned 21. $3 million. That was the combined payout from Richard and Eleanor's life insurance policies. James Farrell had controlled that money for 7 years before Michael could legally claim it. When I turned 21, I expected to receive the full amount, Michael continued. But James told me that most of it had been used for my care, my therapy, my education. He gave me less than $100,000 and a stack of supposed receipts that didn't add up. When I pressed him, he became threatening. That's when the memories really started coming back. I spent the rest of that day pulling the original case files, reviewing every interview, every piece of evidence. James Farrell had been interviewed briefly. His alibi that he was at home with his wife had been deemed solid. His wife had corroborated his statement. With no physical evidence linking him to the scene and a credible alibi, we had moved on to more promising suspects. But now, looking at the timeline with fresh eyes, inconsistencies emerged. James claimed to have learned about the murders when police called him at 4:30 a.m. Phone records showed he had called a lawyer at 3:15 a.m., more than an hour before he supposedly knew about the crime. His wife, now his ex-wife, had filed for divorce 2 years after the murders. When I tracked her down, she was living across the country under her maiden name. "I've been waiting for this call," she said when I identified myself. "I've been carrying this for 10 years. She confessed that James had left the house around midnight on the night of the murders and hadn't returned until nearly 3:30 a.m. He had made her lie to the police about his whereabouts. When she had confronted him later about her suspicions, he had become violent, threatening her life if she ever spoke the truth. "He came home with blood on his clothes," she told me, her voice shaking even after all these years. "He burned them in the backyard fire pit that same night. I helped him. God forgive me, I helped him." With this new information, I began re-examining every piece of evidence from the Walker case. The bloody boot print that had been attributed to Walker, James Farrell and Walker wore the same size shoe. The partial handprint on the banister that hadn't matched any family member. It had never been compared to Farrell's prints. Most disturbing of all, the watch belonging to Richard Reynolds that had been found in Walker's toolbox. The most damning piece of evidence against him had been logged into evidence by a junior officer who had processed the scene and who, it turned out, was James Farrell's former brother-in-law from a previous marriage, a connection we had missed. The case against Terrence Walker began to unravel thread by thread, but it was too late. Terrence Walker had been executed by lethal injection on November 12, 2008, 5 years before Michael Reynolds walked into my office with his recovered memories. Walker's last words, recorded by the prison warden, were, "I didn't do it. Someday you'll know." That day had come, and the knowledge was devastating. Have you ever been complicit in a terrible mistake? Have you ever been absolutely certain of something only to discover later that you were absolutely wrong? I have. The weight of it is almost unbearable. I reopened the Reynolds murder investigation officially in 2013. Over the next 2 years, I built a case against James Farrell that would have been strong enough to convict DNA from preserved crime scene samples that had never been tested against Farrell's profile. Financial records showing his massive gambling debts before the murders and suspicious investments afterward. Testimony from his ex-wife about his behavior and actions the night of the killings. But I would never get the chance to see him brought to justice. James Farrell died of a heart attack in 2015 before I could complete the investigation. He went to his grave never having answered for his crimes, the murder of his sister and her family, and the framing of an innocent man. Terrence Walker never received justice. Neither did the Reynolds family. The system failed them all, and I was part of that system. Part 3. The Reckoning. Now, let me take you to a pivotal moment in this investigation that changed everything, a moment that forced me to confront not just the facts of the case, but the fundamental flaws in our justice system. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October 2014. I'd been working obsessively on building the case against James Farrell, combing through evidence both old and new. My desk was covered with files, photos, reports, the remnants of 2 investigations separated by a decade. My phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Detective Shernan," I answered, distracted by the documents in front of me. "Detective, this is Marlene Walker." The name hit me like a physical blow. Terrence Walker's wife. The woman who had sat stoically through her husband's trial, who had visited him faithfully during his years on death row, who had witnessed his execution. "Mrs. Walker," I said, suddenly fully present. "How can I help you?" "I found something," she said. "Something Terry told me to keep safe. He said if anything happened to him, I should wait 5 years and then find someone I could trust. I think that's you." We met at a diner off Highway 16, a nondescript place where the coffee was strong and the conversations private. Marlene Walker had aged beyond her 52 years. Grief had carved permanent lines around her eyes and mouth. She slid a sealed envelope across the table to me. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten letter from Terrence Walker, dated 2 weeks before his execution. "I know I'm going to die for something I didn't do," he had written. "I've made peace with that as much as any man can, but I need the truth to come out someday. James Farrell killed the Reynolds family." He came to me the day after it happened, asking me to dispose of a knife and some bloody clothes. He said it was from a deer he'd poached and didn't want his wife to know. I did it without asking questions because he'd gotten me the job with the Reynolds and I owed him. I didn't know what he'd done until the police showed up at my door. By then, it was too late. He'd already planted evidence in my garage and my truck. I realize now he was setting me up from the beginning. The letter continued with details that only the killer or someone with intimate knowledge of the crime could have known, details about the position of the bodies, about items disturbed in the house, about a broken figurine that had never been mentioned in the trial or the press. "Why didn't your husband tell us this during the investigation?" I asked Marlene, my coffee growing cold between my hands. "He was afraid," she said simply. "James Farrell threatened to kill me if Terry talked. He had connections from his gambling days. Dangerous people. Terry thought that if he just maintained his innocence, the truth would come out eventually through the evidence. He didn't understand how the system works. The system. That nebulous entity composed of people like me, people who believed they were serving justice but were, in fact, sometimes, its greatest impediment. That letter was the turning point. It forced me to confront not just the facts of this particular case, but the fundamental flaws in how we determine guilt and innocence. Our criminal justice system is designed around a simple premise. It is better to let 10 guilty people go free than to convict one innocent person. But in practice, once the machinery of prosecution begins turning, it develops a momentum that can be nearly impossible to stop. Prosecutors don't advance their careers by dropping charges. Detectives don't get commendations for admitting they followed the wrong lead. Judges and juries, presented with evidence that seems conclusive, rarely question its provenance or reliability. And so innocent people go to prison. Sometimes they go to their deaths. In the years since that meeting with Marlene Walker, I've dedicated myself to reviewing cases like Terrence's cases, where the evidence seemed solid but cracks appeared in retrospect. I've helped overturn 17 convictions. Not all were death penalty cases, but each represented a life derailed by a system more concerned with closure than truth. I want you to consider this. How certain do we need to be to take a person's life in the name of justice? 99, 99, 9. Even at 99 certainty, if we've executed 500 people since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, that would mean approximately 15 innocent people have been put to death. Is that an acceptable margin of error when human life is at stake? For Terrence Walker, for his family, for the Reynolds family who never saw true justice served, the answer must be no. Part 4. The Legacy. Michael Reynolds and I have developed an unlikely friendship in the years since he walked into my office with his recovered memories. Together, we've established the Terrence Walker Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization that works to identify and overturn wrongful convictions, particularly in capital cases. The damage can never be undone. Terrence Walker cannot be brought back to life. The time he lost with his family cannot be restored. The pain inflicted on both the Walker and Reynolds families cannot be erased. But there can be acknowledgement. There can be change. There can be a commitment to do better. In 2017, the governor issued a posthumous pardon to Terrence Walker based on the evidence we uncovered. It was a symbolic gesture, but an important onion official recognition of a catastrophic failure of justice. The junior officer who had planted evidence at James Farrell's behest was eventually identified and prosecuted. He's serving a 20-year sentence for evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. These are small victories in the face of an enormous tragedy, but they matter. They matter because they represent truth emerging, however belatedly, from darkness. I'm retired from official police work now, but I will never retire from the pursuit of justice. My files are still open, my phone still rings with calls from desperate people claiming innocence, and I still listen more carefully now than ever before. I want to ask you something. What would you do if you found yourself accused of a crime you didn't commit? How would you prove your innocence when all the evidence seems to point to your guilt? Who would believe you against the weight of a system designed to find you culpable? These aren't abstract questions. They're questions that people face every day in our criminal justice system. People like Terrence Walker. The flaws that led to Walker's wrongful execution still exist. Eyewitness testimony, despite being notoriously unreliable, especially in traumatic situations, still carries tremendous weight in trials. Physical evidence can still be manipulated or misinterpreted. Prosecutors still face pressure to secure convictions rather than to find the truth. And the death penalty, that most final and irreversible of punishments, still exists in many states, despite the incontrovertible evidence that we sometimes get it wrong. I believe in accountability. I believe that those who commit heinous crimes should face severe consequences. But I no longer believe that we can administer the death penalty with enough certainty to justify its use. The risk of executing an innocent person is not theoretical, it is real, as Terrence Walker's case tragically demonstrates. If this story has affected you, I urge you to learn more about wrongful convictions and the work being done to prevent them. Organizations like the Innocence Project, the Equal Justice Initiative, and our own Terrence Walker Justice Initiative need support to continue their vital work. Consider sharing this story with friends and family. The more people understand the real risks inherent in our criminal justice system, the more pressure there will be to reform it. And if you're ever called to serve on a jury, remember Terrence Walker. Remember that beyond a reasonable doubt is a high standard for a reason, and that your decision could literally be a matter of life and death. Conclusion. A detective's moral. Every detective carries cases that haunt them, the ones that got away, the ones that went wrong, the ones that challenged everything they thought they knew about justice. For me, Terrence Walker's case isn't just haunting, it's transformative. It taught me that certainty is an illusion. That systems, no matter how well designed, are only as good as the people operating them. That justice delayed is indeed justice denied, but that false justice is no justice at all. Above all, it taught me humility. The humility to question my own conclusions, to remain open to new evidence, to admit when I'm wrong. I began my career believing that determination and intelligence were a detective's most valuable tools. I'm ending it knowing that doubt constructive, questioning doubt is equally important. The willingness to consider that you might be wrong could be the thing that ultimately leads you to the truth. As Detective Shernan, I've seen the worst of humanity, the capacity for cruelty, for deception, for callous disregard of others' lives. But I've also seen remarkable courage, resilience, and the unquenchable human desire for truth. Terrence Walker maintained his innocence until his final breath. Michael Reynolds fought for years to recover memories that his mind had buried to protect him. Marlene Walker kept faith with her husband's memory even after the system had discarded him. These are acts of moral courage that humble me. So what is the lesson here? What can we take away from this tragic story? Perhaps it's simply this: truth matters, justice matters. And both are fragile things that require constant vigilance to protect. I don't know if you believe in any kind of afterlife. I'm not sure what I believe myself after all I've seen. But I like to think that somewhere, somehow, Terrence Walker knows that his last words came true. Someday, you'll know. We do know now. Too late to save him, but perhaps not too late to save others like him. Before I end this, I want to speak directly to you, the viewer. Have you ever been absolutely certain about something, only to discover later you were wrong? How did you handle that realization? Did you resist it, or did you adapt your understanding to accommodate the new truth? These questions aren't just philosophical. They're practical guides for navigating a world where certainty is rare and mistakes can have devastating consequences. If this story has moved you, please share it with others who might learn from it. Subscribe to the Shernan channel for more investigations into cases that challenge our understanding of justice. And remember that the criminal justice system, for all its flaws, is composed of people who can learn, grow, and change if they're willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Thank you for listening to The Last Confession. This is Detective Marcus Shernan, signing off.